Okay. Um, so welcome everybody to the third in the series of Cheiron seminar on the history of horses and horsemanship. Today we'll be talking about medieval beads, curved beads, hinged beads. We will have three speakers: Nate McCormack, Timothy Dawson, and Frederik Kirch. Sorry, Frederik. And yeah, each of them are speaking for something like 20 minutes or less or a little bit more, depending on the situation. And in the meantime, I'll ask people to hold on to their questions or put them in the chat if they feel like they could forget them. And then after the 60 minutes, the floor is open for discussion. And I hope we are going to have a wonderful and productive discussion. Okay, so let's start with our first speaker. Nate, are you here? You able to, so Nate somewhere.
Yep, I'm here.
Yeah, okay. So
Hello.
I can introduce you if you want. So Nate is an attorney from the US focusing on legal issues related to horses. And Nate is working on diverse issues starting from bond agreements to stunt performance contracts for films, which is very interesting. And he holds a BA degree in history. Also served in the US infantry as a team leader and surgeon. So very versatile experience. And today Nate is going to speak about the analogies between medieval beats and modern beats, which is very interesting. A lot of people made this connection and raised a question in the discussion. So the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that. Before I start, I do have a PowerPoint, so I'm hoping to be able to share my screen, but I don't use Zoom a lot, so I'm going to try. I'm
Yeah,
going to try and see if I don't mess it up.
you should be able
All
to
right, let's
share
see.
if something doesn't happen. No, I think you
Okay.
it's you can we can see it now.
Yeah, we look good.
Yeah, perfect.
Can everybody see that? Awesome. Okay, great. So, hello, everybody. I'm Nate McCormack. As Anastasia had said, I'm from Pennsylvania in the United States. And today I'm talking about what I call the California connection. So, I'm talking about is spade bits and their connection to different cultures and at different times throughout history. So, couple introductions. Here's a sweet picture of me doing some jousting. Almost like a disclaimer, I wanted to kind of put all of my cards on the table to make sure everybody knows sort of where I'm coming from with this information and my perspective. So right there in bold, I am not a professional historian. I did study history as an undergraduate. It was not specifically focused on medieval studies. It was a general history study, but I got to have the freedom to focus on the topics that I wanted to. So I spent a lot of time studying medieval history. So that's kind of my academic bona fides, you might say, which is not much. The picture that you see here, this is not a historical living history joust. This is at a Renaissance fair in Pennsylvania. I do Renaissance fair jousting, and I've been doing it for about 12 years. All of the gear is mostly completely ahistorical. It's supposed to look the part. It's not actually the part. But you know, it does kind of scratch the itch for me because that's about as much in-depth historical jousting as someone could have access to here in Pennsylvania. So, with my disclaimer out of the way, I'm going to go on with the presentation, which is about spade bits. So this is a great picture of an artistic drawing of a spade bit. I don't know the individual, but his name is down there at the bottom. So I wanted to use that just because it has some great labels to kind of point to the different pieces. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of the key components as I understand it. Again, because I'm not a professional here, but as I understand it, these are some of the key components that separate a spade bit from maybe some other types of bits. So the first one is the spade, right? And the spade is this thing here. Sometimes it's also called a spoon. I've heard it or seen it referred to as a spoon. I've also seen bits that have something like this, but don't call it either a spade or a spoon. So I'm assuming they serve the same function. And I'll go into a little bit more detail of the function of the spade bit further down the line. But right now I'll just go over the components. So this is the spade part of the spade bit, and that sits on the horse's tongue and can make contact with the horse's palate. The cannon or the mouthpiece right here, this is what connects these two shanks. In a spade bit, they do have action on the bars of the horse's mouth. It's not quite the same as bar relief, where the bar is only sitting above, but it is supposed to have contact at times with the bars of the horse's mouth. There's the shanks on the side, which allows the movement of the rein to translate through into the body of the bit. One of the other key components here is the curb strap. Here it's labeled as lip chains or chin chains. I've never heard them referred to as chin chains before, but that's how it's labeled here. So this is sort of the basic artistic depiction of what a spade bit is. So spade bits are really interesting. I think they are, at least, because they seem to have started in antiquity in ancient North Africa with a tribe of the Berbers. I think they're called the Zahidi tribe. They seem to have used very similar bits to what a spade bit is. I think in my next slide I have a picture. Yeah, right here. So okay, let me move this guy. There we go. Might be in the way. We're going to minimize. Perfect. All right. So this is a picture of the type of bit. Whoops, too far. Type of bit that I'm talking about when I talk about the North African style of bit. This is coming from a website, Works of Chivalry. This is the author right down here. Whoops, I'm messing this up. That's the author right down here. So I have a couple sort of block quotes throughout the presentation. The author that I'm drawing from is cited at the bottom, but I don't have a bibliography. Didn't think I needed it for these purposes, but most of this information is coming from this individual here and his post about the differences between alla Ginetta and alla Brida writing style. So according to the author, the alla Ginetta writing style included these types of bits that were present in North Africa. Those bits were also found later on in Spain. They eventually moved into Europe. And then what's really interesting is that when the vaqueros, when the Spanish cattleman culture moved from Spain to New Spain, which would have been Mexico and the States, they also brought their horsemanship with them. And so now in southwestern America, so down in Arizona and Texas, and particularly in California, there is this culture still of what they would typically be called the California bridle horse, where they're still doing this sort of, they're making spade bit horses very similar to the original vaqueros who were in Mexico, but they came from Spain, and ultimately they shared this connection back to the ancient tribes in North Africa that were using this similar type of bitting in their horses. So that's what I think is one of the more interesting connections here about these bits, is that really seems to have crossed continents. And yet, at least for my part in the United States, we know very little about spade bits. It took a very, very long time for me to find even the most general information on spade bits, because in the United States, I'm not sure how it is in Europe, but we really have two separate equine cultures. There's either the English culture, which is, your dressage, your hunter jumpers, and then you have the Western culture, which is the cattle roping, rodeo, barrel racing, and those two equine cultures are truly separate cultures. Like, people who are Western riders, they dress that way all the time. Like, it is a and more of an identity than it is just a different discipline. And so those are the two major equine cultures here. And the California bridle horses, the spade bit horses, they are like a very, very small subculture within the Western riding culture. So there's very little information available for about them. They occupy a very small part of the sort of equine culture here in the States. So the information that I have been able to find, it's been difficult to get a hold of, but it's, again, I find it fascinating that it appears here in the United States, even though it has this ancient connection. So going back to the bits that were found in North Africa, this style, they are, you see here at the bottom, I have it highlighted in red, that these bits were formed by having two short shanks connected by a cannon with a central shovel that rested flat on the horse's tongue, and on top of the large metal rings were attached. The ring passed under the lower jaw on the animal, acted as a curb chain. Very similar design to the spade bit. It has this central shovel, right? And that central shovel is resting on the tongue, and it's connected to these shanks that are connected to the curb strap. So it's very, very similar style to even what the modern spade bit, at least in appearance, looks like. So moving a little bit further along in history, we have this bit that comes from somewhere between the 7th and the 9th century, Andalusian Spain. And this here is a quote from the plaque that the museum, or sorry, the Metropolitan Museum. This bit is currently at the Met. And they have information about this bit, which specifically says that it resembles spade bits used by some Western style riders today. It has a large projecting tongue or port that would have been inserted into the horse's mouth. So this isn't exactly like the first picture I showed, the diagram of the spade bit where it had a central cannon, and then it also had that protruding shovel. But it does seem to look a lot like a spade bit. I'm not sure if it would function the same as a spade bit, but even here the Met is also identifying this as something like a spade bit, and this existed again in somewhere between the 7th and 9th century in Andalusian Spain. So then from Spain, we get to sort of the more modern era, or at least the post-industrial era, which is we have the vaquero cattlemen in Spain, but then they moved to New Spain, which eventually became Mexico, and their culture survived there. That the equestrian cattleman culture of the professional cattlemen in Spain was transplanted to New Spain, to Mexico, and it survived there, and it still has, in a way, survived there. Even the name vaquero in the States, I don't know if anybody else has heard the term, but we have a term for cowboys. Sometimes they're referred to as buckaroos. That word buckaroo was a bastardization of the word vaquero because of the way it was pronounced. And so the American cowboy culture really has a lot to thank from the vaquero culture, because that's where they were really drawing a lot of their information from and a lot of their horsemanship from. Okay, so that's sort of the historical background of the spade bit and the connection throughout the history and these different geographical locations. So I wanted to get into the purpose and the use of the spade bit. Because I think that's also where a lot of my questions are, because again, as I said, I'm not a professional historian, nor am I a professional equine trainer or an expert in bits. So this is the information as I understand it, and I'm looking forward to the subsequent discussion about how these bits may actually work. So again, this information is coming from this lady down here, Gwendolyn Turnbull Weaver, and it's from a publication on this website, and it's just there some thoughts on the spade bit. This is a link to the website itself. So according to Miss Weaver, a spade bit is not a leverage bit. Like most curb bits, she says that a leverage bits work predominantly off of pressure on the curb strap. So reins pull, you pull the shanks down, twists, the curb strap goes up and it connects with the horse's lower jaw. She goes on to say that the spade bit is known as a signal bit rather than a leverage bit. I had never heard the term a signal bit before coming across information about a spade bit. I think it's arguable that any bit is a signal bit or a leverage bit, depending on how you use it. I think if a rider has very soft hands, even something like a snaffle bit, even though you would have consistent contact with the horse's mouth, it's still really more of a signal, especially as you move forward in the refinement of your training. But one of the things that she says here is that the entire purpose of the spade bit is to develop a velvet mouth in the horse, specifically because the horse is meant to pick and carry the bit up themselves. They're supposed to hold the bit in their mouth rather than relying on the rider to have maintaining consistent contact with the horse's mouth. And so the idea is that by training the horse on all of the movements that it would be asked to do before introducing the spade bit into the horse's mouth, you've already trained the horse on how to move, how to be collected, how to move on its hind end, how to hold itself. And then when you introduce the spade bit, it adds that next level of refinement. Because now instead of the horse relying on you to maintain that contact through your hands, the horse is carrying the bit itself. And then it can receive very, very subtle cues just by a small movement of the hand. As she says here, again, it's kind of highlighted in red. The bit's only purpose is to receive the subtle signals sent by the rider's hands. I really like the way she says this down here in this lower sentence. While many leverage bit users' hands scream their instructions, the spade bit horseman's hands softly suggest the requests. I think it's a great sentence to try and kind of encapsulate the philosophy behind what the spade bit is supposed to be, which I think is kind of counter to what the impression often is when you see a spade bit, because it's so big, there's so much going on, it's just all this metal, and it looks like it's a very brutal and very strong bit. Okay, so that's part of the purpose and use. The intent behind it is to promote self-carriage through balance. Again, I have some more quotes continuing from Miss Weaver. The idea here is that the horse is going to learn how to carry himself in a balanced fashion. And when he's doing that in a balanced fashion, the spade bit actually feels pleasant in their mouth. One of the interesting components of modern spade bits, or at least in the California bridle horse tradition, is that these spade bits actually have to be built for each individual horse. So you wouldn't be able to take one spade bit and then just stick it into another horse's mouth. Each one has to be tuned for the horse. In particular, it's the angle of the spoon that needs to be tuned for the horse. I'm actually just going to jump back a little bit. Not that one. I'm going to jump back to this slide here. So the angle at which this sits needs to match the horse's mouth and conformation, so that when it's sitting in sort of a neutral position, it's not being acted on by anything other than gravity. Then that spoon is sitting to where it's comfortable for the horse to be. When you pick up on the reins, it changes the angle of the spoon in the horse's mouth, and the horse's head shifts to fit where that angle goes. Again, it's a great quote from her where she says that it's not unlike a ballerina who's walking with a book on their head. The book itself is not painful, but it's a reminder to maintain the posture required for the dance. I thought that was a great way of trying to capture, again, the philosophy behind what a spade bit is supposed to be doing, which is it's not supposed to be a large piece of metal that is, gives these strong screaming signals, but it's supposed to be something very soft, very subtle, like a book being balanced on top of the head of a ballerina. So one of the reasons why I was interested in learning more about spade bits is because just from understanding the philosophy of them and my experience doing medieval jousting shows for Renaissance fairs is how practical they would be. The idea that you'd be able to have this bit where you didn't have to have a consistent contact with the horse's mouth, so it would free your body up as the rider to be doing other things. Especially the idea of having a horse that's extremely subtle and responsive and has that velvet mouth, right? Something that really the horse that's really focusing in on your body and your balance a little bit less than it is on just those direct reining types of cues. How advantageous that would be as a mounted warrior, especially if you have a shield on your left arm and you have an implement, a fighting implement, a sword or a spear in your right arm, and you're on the battlefield and you're trying to move and you're keeping track of many, many different things. The last thing you want to worry about is am I having the right amount of contact with the horse's mouth? If you have a horse that has a spade bit in that's being receptive to these very, very subtle cues, that is holding itself in carriage rather than relying on you to balance it with your hands, that would make it a lot easier to do your job as a mounted warrior. Just speaking from personal experience, having a shield on your arm, on your left arm, and carrying something in your right, it really robs a lot of dexterity from your left hand, the hand that's actually on the reins. Just because you start moving this object in space and its weight is now part of your arm, and it really just it takes a lot of the dexterity away from that rein hand. So if you can use a tool that doesn't rely so much on you constantly being active in that hand, but is you can almost kind of hold and forget it. You're able to just kind of maintain a certain position with your hand, and depending on whether that position is higher or lower, your horse either collects or relaxes itself. So if you needed a horse to be collected, you pick up your hand a little bit, and all of a sudden that small change has this big difference on the horse. Or if you want the horse to be able to relax or extend itself further, you can drop your hand slightly, and that gives the horse room to move forward. That to me seems like a very, very excellent way to train a horse that's meant to be in combat, because it's so much less reliant on you as the rider. So I included this picture from the Bayeux Tapestry here, just because I'm not trying to argue that what's being depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry are spade bits. However, I think it might be possible, particularly just looking at the way that the reins are being shown here. The horse is, it seems to be in somewhat a level of a collection. It's right on the vertical. The reins seem to be relatively loose. He doesn't seem to have a whole lot of tension here, and his hand is held somewhat high. I know I'm just sort of seeing things where I want to see things, but to me it seems to be curious, and again, it's another area where I'm hopeful that the actual experts here may be able to shed some more light on it. So this is exactly part of my presentation, is I want to invite questions, specifically for some of the things that I've already mentioned. I think personally, and maybe even as a community of historically minded equine enthusiasts, I think studying or knowing more about spade bits may really inform how we view some of the bits that we see in the archaeological record. One of the questions that I have is, are medieval bits that we see in the archaeological record, are they spade bits, or are they really just some type of curb bit? You know, I'm not an expert in spade bits, and so it's hard for me to distinguish maybe if there are nuances between the two that really are separating them. And so spade bits really are this very, very different thing, even though maybe they look somewhat like the curb bits that we see in antiquity. But again, it's a question that I'm sort of posing here for the group. One of the other things that I think is interesting here is the connection to the two different main writing styles, the Alabrida and the Alagineta writing style. The first reference to those comes from Dom Duarte, and he mentions how they're not really difference in writing philosophy. They're really just two different disciplines that a good horseman should master. He should master both the Alagineta and the Alabrida. And then elsewhere in other sources that I've read, it speaks very specifically that the Alabrida was something that was developed for a specific purpose, whether it be jousting or some type of similar combat because of the change in the seat. But my question would be, if the origin of the Alagineta riding style includes something like a spade bit, did that continue on throughout the centuries and into the discipline of Alabrida? And then, of course, any other questions? As I said from the very beginning, I am not a professional historian. I'm an enthusiast. I love the subject. I find it fascinating to study because I feel like it keeps me connected to the history. I love doing the jousting, even though it's not really a historical discipline, just because it gives me that little bit more of a connection to what it may have been like for a knight 1,000 years ago. As Anastasia had mentioned, I myself am a military veteran, so I understand what it's like to wear armor. and live in it, and have it be reliable, being reliant upon it, as well as a weapon. Um, in my experiences as a jousting knight here on these performances, even though it's kind of silly and it's all choreographed and it's really not very historical, I know what it feels like to sit on my horse in the middle of a thunderstorm wearing armor, wondering whether or not my sword is getting rusted because of all the rain. And I'm sure that experience is would have been one that many people had throughout the centuries as they sat there on their horses suffering through the rain and the cold, wondering, oh, geez, like what's going to happen now? So those types of things are what really draws me to participate in this area of research. And this is my first time giving a presentation on it, so hopefully didn't go too bad. I certainly am happy for any questions, any criticisms. I have pretty thick skin. I am an attorney, so I'm used to people telling me that my arguments are wrong. So if I'm wrong here, you're not going to hurt my feelings if you tell me so. So that's all I have as far as the bits go. I did have this quick little slide. This is a thank you slide. These are the two horses that I have. There's Xena and Rambo. Xena is an off-the-track thoroughbred. She is 7 years old. We got her pretty recently. She was too slow for her racing career, so she only had 2 starts before she was kicked out. And aren't we glad that she was? So she's my wife's horse. And then this handsome fella, his name is Rambo. He's also a new addition. I just got him a month ago. He was a rescue from an Amish individual. He was a buggy horse. They purchased him. He wasn't strong enough to pull all 6 of the family, the 10 miles to church and then the 10 miles back. And so they started keeping him just in a dry lot. And he started dropping a lot of weight, got very, 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 very thin. But he was such a personable horse. He's a very handsome horse, as you can tell. At least I think he is. And so I decided to buy him and give him a little bit of a better home. So those are our 2 equine children. So that's it for me. Thank you very much for hanging in there with me, and I hope at least it was a little bit informative. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Nate. I think that's the best explanation of how a spade bit works. For me, it's like I don't know much about this context, so this is very good. And I think the comments in the chat, Kate has made some comments as well, which I can read. So we will go to
Oh, great.
Timothy's talk, and then we will return to your questions. And I think most people here are practitioners having horses. Timothy also has experience in horsemanship. Frederik also has, and Victoria also have horses, which is perfect. I guess we can like look at both historical part and see how it applies to our experience. So I'll introduce Timothy, whom I've known for many years as we have co-organized workshops, displays, or Timothy has organized displays and horse history sessions at the International Medieval Congress. And he's has been organized by displays of equestrian equipment of their reconstructions by Levante. He is also my co-editor on the book series Rewriting Equestrian History series and on a few other publications, so too many to mention. And he holds a PhD from the University of New England, and now he's independent scholar based in the UK. And yes, so his expertise in the dress and regalia in medieval Byzantium. So he has published extensively on this. Like there are too many publications for me to mention, I guess. No, the rest, the floor is to Timothy, and he has recently made a wonderful bridle for our horse to match with the wonderful saddle. So the bridle is here if you want to discuss it at the bit, which we have tested and loved it. The feedback from the main interested actor, our conic for whom it was made, feedback was like, thumbs up. She loves the bridle. So, Timothy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anastasia. I'm going to start off making a bit of a similar disclaimer to Nate, because while Anastasia's waxed lyrical about my academic activities, until essentially until I met Anastasia at an International Medieval Congress that had not been in any sense academic. So I took up writing early in my time involved in reenactment on the basis of, well, you can't be properly medieval if you don't ride a horse, and went pretty much straight into doing military riding with a small group of friends. And initially, at the patronage of someone who had horses, but was not herself in any sense a sophisticated or educated horse person herself. It was just very casual and practical, and she was quite happy for me and others to get on the horses and just try doing stuff. In a sense, and her comment was after a first excursion, thrashing around the bush in Australia, was, "Well, you didn't fall off, you'll be right," and then left me and my companions to get on with things. Shortly afterwards, I started getting some horses myself, and that then was, in a sense, the start of my education, because one of the horses I got had been very well trained for a game called polo cross, which some or perhaps all of you know something of, which is a ball game, but quite different from polo, as it involves not hitting a ball around the ground, but scooping it up in a net on a stick and then riding until you can throw it into a goal, whilst your members of the opposing team try to deprive you of the ball by wailing at your stick officially, but sometimes at your head, I'm told, with their sticks into to make you drop the ball so that they can seize control and go. And it bears a remarkable resemblance to a game that's documented in some considerable detail in medieval sources from Constantinople in particular. So tried to establish several years ago whether there was a connection, but unfortunately that couldn't be established. And so it may be a kind of accidental reinvention. We'll probably never know. But so I got this horse, and he was, as I say, brilliantly trained and taught me an awful lot. And part of his training was that he responded very, very precisely to shifts of weight and quite gentle neck reining, even at speed. So in a sense, I never had to confront the bitting issue. And insofar as I looked at it, well, perhaps you'd say I was a bit squeamish, because I thought, well, I wouldn't like big lumps of metal shoved in my mouth particularly. And so it was just a matter of using the bit that has been ubiquitous throughout the history of horsemanship, the good old snaffle, with the one sort of variation of looking at some of the examples and seeing that a sidebar snaffle resembles some of the surviving archaeological versions that go beyond the plainest kind of snaffle bits. So I only ever used those. And the other thing too, getting back to some of the things that Nate was talking about, when I was doing things with a shield, the way they were doing there's quite a considerable range of fittings on the shields in the Bayeux Tapestry. And I took one design and I worked out a way of using that particular design in a manner that's not shown in the Bayeux Tapestry, but actually is highly effective, settles the shield in a very accurately in the most optimal position, whilst being able to be used in a way that leaves your left hand completely free to manipulate the reins. But because of the way this horse responded, I always was used to riding with very loose reins and relying on neck reining at quite a subtle level. So I never really had to think too much about bitting in those days. And even when I moved on into the age of chivalry, I came across a manuscript picture that showed the interior of a shield from the 13th century, which had similar characteristics to the ones I'd worked out in, of settling the shield firmly and securely, but leaving the left hand free. And so I've used that ever since. And again, it evaded the issue of worrying about the bitting. But as I got into building saddlery pretty early on as well, and resumed that 10 years ago, a bit more than 10 years ago in Britain. And so going around the markets to sell historical replica saddles and bridles and so on, a number of people asked me here and there if I made medieval bits. So I was made to look at it again, and clearly they weren't talking about snaffles, even though we can see that snaffles were used in military use all through the medieval period as well as earlier and since. And then we had to look at things like the example that Nate showed from the Bayeux embroidery of what are called hinged bits. And it's taken me a long time to really get a grasp of how they worked. In one sense, it's obvious that it insulates the horse's mouth from vigorous activity that you might have to engage in while you're doing things militarily on horseback, and particularly looking back to the Roman period, where they didn't even have the guise strap to support the weight of the shield. And so they just had to hold it in their hand, in their left hand, and hold the reins in the same hand. It was quite a challenge. And this was revisited actually about 7 years ago now, when they did the Hadrian's cavalry terma exercise up in Scotland, where they finally got together 30 Roman riders. And there was a lot of cheating, because the whole sort of equipping that many riders in an approximately period style is a big effort. Couldn't be done properly. There just wasn't the budget for it. And because the understanding of Roman bits was not there, people lots of them were good riders, but hadn't done any particularly historical military riding particularly. So lots of the shields there were slung on guise straps, shoulder straps, just to support the weight, because otherwise it really wasn't going to work very well. So I now have gone to the stage, I put off even trying to make a medieval style bit, for a long time, because I just didn't feel that I understood well enough how they functioned. And frankly, they just looked scary, you know. And even the simpler medieval ones that are simpler, those spade bits that Nate was showing us, still looked a bit scary as big lumps of metal that I didn't think I'd want to shove in a horse's mouth, especially without knowing what they were going to do. But thanks primarily to years of discussion and plenty of information from people like John Clark and mental blank, our other speaker, to whom I owe a great deal in this understanding, I now have taken the plunge and made a number of these bits. And the first one failed because I just still didn't quite understand. Because the question was, yes, you've got the hinged portion of the bit insulating the horse's mouth from vigorous activities. But then what happens if you really needed to actually give it a firm inhibition and pull up? And what did they do then? So that's now clear to me. And the answer, in one sense, to Nate's question is that hinged bits actually, they are, some of them are equivalent to spade bits, and some of them are equivalent to curb bits, even though they're not exactly identical in the way they function. Now, this is one of the ones that I have reproduced. This is based upon two examples that are almost identical, one from Hungary and one from England. And this has been replicated before for a time team episode. I've adapted the design slightly to facilitate the fact that I don't have a forge. I have to use sort of slightly more modern methods to do it, but it's essentially the same form. And at this end, you've got the loops that actually hook onto the bridle. And at the bottom of the hinged portion here, you've got the loops that take the reins. So this flexes quite freely. But the way it turns out these work is that on them, there is a pair of lugs. Now I'm going to share my screen because one of those pictures that Nate had is relevant. Let's make sure I've got it. Yep. What? Okay. So there you have that bit from the Metropolitan Museum that Nate showed us. And the reins are onto the large square arms on the right-hand side of the screen, and the bridle pieces are onto the square panels that are at the extending vertically. Now it's canted a long way down more than it would be in a horse's natural posture, but it's near enough. So the blue arrow is what happens when the reins, the way the hinged portion flexes as it goes back. The white arrow points at the lug on these arms that, when fully retracted, engage against the rings that hold the mouthpiece that extends across, and you can then see the spade projecting up in between them. And so this type of spade bit, hinged bit, primarily works by, when it's fully retracted, those spurs pull the bit up. I'm going to see sharing. Pull these bits up. And on this, I've actually put the lugs on the inside there rather than on the outside as they are in the historical examples, because that was easier for me to make them that way. But it still works the same way, because you get to there in terms of the reins being pulled back, and it then starts to cant the whole structure upwards. Now, what that then does in the horse's mouth is that this bit, the equivalent of the spade, then raises inside the horse's mouth and may come into contact with its palate, giving it a very direct message. And Frederik may say more about this. So that's one of the ways this type of bit works. The other way, and in fact, it's both older and later, is the one that's equivalent to a curb. And they're older in the sense that they exist in the Roman tradition, Roman archaeology, and then they get revived again a little bit later than the bit that I've just shown. And what the way they work is, here's a close-up of the one that I made for Anastasia. And so you've got your plain bar in the horse's mouth. You've got your hinged piece running there with the bend in it that's quite characteristic of medieval ones. But the way this then works is that when it's retracted, you're not engaging with the rest of the structure of the bit, but this bar here then comes into contact with the horse's jaw underneath and exerts pressure there in a sort of rigid equivalent of a modern curb chain, and therefore gives the communication in that respect. So I'm very glad that it's been a success. And I hopefully gets a chance to actually try some more stuff myself in some time in the future and make a few more examples that more people can get to use. And then perhaps we'll get more accurately represented historical writing in some contexts. And so I think that's all I really got to say at this point. I'll pass the microphone back, so to speak.
Thank you, Timothy, for this explanation. So, um, after these two presentations, I will pass the floor to Frederik, who will just make a kind of informal response based on his experience working on historical bits, and then we will open the floor to general discussion, so we can talk about bits and what we think about them. So Frederik Sebastian Kirch studied archaeology and history in Cologne, and after his PhD about the Roman cavalry garrison in Weissenberg, he started to work in the Heritage Conservation Office in Baden-Württemberg, Germany. His main research focus lies in medieval riding equipment, special development of horse bits from Roman times to the 16th century, and he's sharing the room with Victoria Hack, who is also a writer, and maybe who can also offer some comments. I don't know. Okay, having him. So, Frederik, if you have comments,
yeah, maybe
you're welcome to make them. Well, yeah.
Thank you, Anastasia, and also thank you, Timothy and Nate, for your presentations. As I said, just let's start an informal discussion. I think especially Nate's presentation was nice in that way that it dealt a lot with the modern misconceptions that we have about medieval writing or historical writing in general, and the equipment that is connected to that. I think one point that we have to keep in mind is that we have to always to be careful to not interchange misconceptions with other misconceptions, for example. Yeah, for example, the point that with verb bits, you have always like this constant pressure on the reins, contrary to the spade bit where you don't have that. From my experience and research, that in itself is already a bit problematic because it projects this modern style of writing with curb bits to historical periods where the concept of having constant pressure on the reins is absolutely not the norm. That only developed in the 19th century. So we have to be a bit careful with that when dealing with reconstructing the historical writing styles. For example, the point that only the spade bit is a balance bit is let's do it like that. Is something that is not really found or that you cannot really say when you deal with originals. Because, for example, also medieval originals are always very balanced and encourage the horse to have the head in sort of a vertical or in front of the vertical position. Another example I just took from the shelf from our own collection, which is not medieval, but a bit of around 1700. I hope you guys can see that. That is the bit in which Victoria started her stallion, Giovanni. And if you see, for example, with these heavy curb chains of the Baroque era, I just have to adjust the glove. If we now, for example, move the bit, you can see that the whole equipment in itself, if I start moving the bit quite vigorously, I hope you guys can see, you should see that the portion of the mouthpiece itself is relatively stable, therefore acting also like the concept of the spade bit itself, having this big balance point, encouraging the horse to a certain head position. And that is basically a fact that we have with all the bits from late antiquity up to the late 1700s. But we also, and that is also true with myself, because I also fall sometimes to this trope of romanticizing medieval times, which you shouldn't do. But we also, of course, have in the sources the facts that give us the foundation to say, well, obviously, like always, it's not everything is black and white, but we are in a gray area, because also in written sources, especially, for example, in private letters of the German nobility in the 14th and 15th century, we often read, for example, oh, okay, I cannot deal with this tournament stallion anymore, but you can have him because you have a much stronger hand than I, and you can hold him. So we see in the archaeological record, in the equipment itself, that the equipment was aimed at having the horse in balance, just encouraging, not forcing via pressure. But we also have in the written sources facts that, yeah, obviously there were some bad riders back then as well. Just another, maybe for future research for Nate, I can give you the publication afterwards. The earliest archaeological bit à la Jeannette, so a ring bit, in Western Africa is found around 1400, and they appear on the European continent only in the last quarter of the 15th century. But then they get rather quickly popular, especially in Spain and southern France. And how popular they get in that quick time, for example, is can be seen. We have archaeological excavations in the New World from Cortes's campaigns that are quietly plausibly dated to 1521, and there already in the archaeological record are ring bits, which are in the archaeological record of the 16th century in Germany, relatively sparse. So you can see that these bits à la Jeannette must have been quite popular, at least already in the early 16th century in the Iberian Peninsula. And now we don't need that. I just had another ring bit here. Considering Timothy, I don't think I have to say very much, because you pointed already out the most points that are somewhat problematic when reconstructing equipment, because obviously when you change some features, it already behaves quite differently. I think it's a really good start to get into this reconstruction business, and to get these first glimpses on how these things work. Especially, I remember that there has been a huge discussion in the Roman archaeological community if these transversal bars of antique bits are actually supposed to make contact in the chin groove. And it was just last year that Vicky and I, we sort of supervised an experiment at the Fürstliche Hofreitschule Bückeburg, where they reconstructed several antique bits, for example, the famous Newstead bit. And first of all, you are able to do high school movements in antique bits. And the second point that I was really glad that we could actually prove that the transversal bar is definitely intended to make contact with the chin groove and act as the main source of information if the horse is not fully collected and in the front, in the vertical. Yeah. So that was my monologue. I hope if there are questions, I have a few pictures of further medieval bits if people want to see them, but I would say let's start the broad discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frederik. So Timothy, you have a raised hand if you wanted to say something.
Yes. Yes, it was something I meant to say in response to Nate, in that I do not believe that there's any necessary connection between this distinction between the Alabrida writing style and the Alaginitas writing style. The impression that I have, and well, there may be people who are better placed to make this judgment. I think that why this notion suddenly appears in literature is simply that the standard riding style for Western Europe, the standard military armored riding style for Western Europe, and well, actually, I think it was pretty much the only riding style for Western Europe, was the sitting to every gate. Now, of course, you want to do that in armour because you don't want to be bouncing up and down or having to try to rise to a trot in the modern way if you're wearing 30 to 40 kilograms more armour on top of your body weight. So I had an article in a recent publication on cavalry warfare where I argue this point in connection, particularly in connection with the diffusion of stirrups, that it had no, the ancient writing style in the West pre-stirrups, necessarily you're sitting to every gate. And I think it's quite obvious that even though stirrups were adopted, well, for hundreds of years, they did not change the riding style. They were essentially just a mounting aid and a backup for extreme situations where some things happened and the rider goes off balance. But they're still sitting to every gate. And of course the classic medieval riding style with the legs extended forward, you're not really going to be able to balance yourself in the same ways we're used to doing on the stirrups, except in fairly extreme circumstances. And so the distinction in a riding style comes in because the step riding style, which had adapted to stirrups much earlier, and therefore people were short, the stirrups were shorter, and people were into this mode of raising themselves with weight on the stirrups, had percolated round from down through the Middle East, across North Africa, and then back up across the Straits into European awareness in Spain, producing this conception that there might be another way of doing things. And a bit later, you get the same process feeding in to Northern Europe from the East with the kind of Hungarian riding influence as well, which again flows across from Central Asia. And I think that's the real distinction. And you can do these riding styles, both of these riding styles, on any bit you like, because it doesn't particularly affect that degree of communication. Now, I say this again on the basis more on practical experience, because when my companions and I started riding, we had a disparate group who were interested in both Eastern and Western techniques. So along with putting on my mail and charging out there as a Norman knight in the full weight of kit, I was also doing things like I had a nice little Arab mare, very sprightly and very beautiful and very vain, but I was doing a lot of mounted archery, and we were also doing Eastern games like a version of Bushkazi and the javelin game that we know from the Romans all the way through, which is manic fun. I'd have to recommend to anybody who wants to do crazy but enjoyable things on horseback. So I was riding in both styles, but even in terms of the mounted archery, you don't actually need to raise in the stirrups to do your mounted archery. Even the Parthian shots, shooting directly backwards, you can do still essentially sitting to the gate. So I think they're just the bitting and the riding style are two completely separate realms of practice that don't interact particularly. So that's all I had to say on that. course, I'm quite happy to have anyone descend upon me and tell me I'm completely wrong too, because well, thanks to you, Nate, I've already had sort of various things clarified in my mind. So thanks.
Well, I mean, I have two questions for you, if you don't mind. One is following up on something that you had said during your presentation, and the other one is just following up on what you just said. So I'll start on following up with what you had just said, that the writing style and the bit aren't necessarily they're directly connected. So my question would be, when you want the horse to be, or you want a horse to be, I don't have any better words to use other than the modern jargon, so forgive me. But if you want the horse to be collected, balanced, maybe more on the hindquarters, something more like what you would see in for a mounted combatant who's using a spear or a sword, where they're needing to be more nimble than somebody who's trying to ride as fast as they can so they can make shots and get out of dodge. Is there then a connection between the type of bit used there and the type of riding style? And maybe not, right? Because I mean, you can have a horse that's very well collected on a snaffle bit, just like you can have a horse that's very well connected on these other ancient bits too. So maybe that's exactly right. I'm just sort of throwing the question out there. Yeah.
Well, in one sense, I can't answer your question, being, as I say, an uneducated, crude rider. This whole business of collection and all that kind of stuff is not something I consciously understand. And so I can't really even begin to answer that question in the manner that you pose it.
Yeah. Well, I'll certainly open the field up for anybody else who wants to respond before I ask another question. I don't want to dominate the conversation.
Yeah, so any
then you're next. I just wanted to add, yes, I agree. The style of your riding isn't necessarily based on the bit or the equipment that you're using, but as always in human culture, we have traditional elements, and a lot of people that did ride in the Geneta style, they did use the ring bit, and obviously it was so apparent that this style is connected to the ring bits that, for example, in the bit makers order from early 16th century in Augsburg, they are already called that, bits alla Geneta, that because they could have used just the term ring, curb, or whatever. But yeah, of course, you can do all level of riding, all styles of riding, and all the equipment. It just depends on how versed are you in this, and how much time are you willing to invest in that. For example, Victoria is doing all high school movements except for schools above the air. We are not there yet. Without stirrups, in a pad, sometimes with just the neck rope, sometimes with the historical curb. So yeah, it isn't forcefully connected to the equipment, but some equipment does help with certain let's put it, steps of development of the horse. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, steps of the development. Well, that's a great way to put it, because even as far as I understand the spade bit schooling, it starts off with a basal. They're not even using a bit in the modern or the vaquero California bridle horse. They're starting in basals before they go into usually the next bit, at least modern bit. So they still use snaffles, and then they graduate into a spade bit after 5 or 6 years worth of schooling. Would it be fair to say then that there's almost a philosophical, like a question of the philosophy that you bring toward equitation going on, as well as the mechanics of the bit? So, what I mean by that is, You can really see it in the way people write. The people who currently practice, spade bit horsemanship, for them it's almost a religious thing, right? Like at least that's what I pick up from when I read their sources. It's like some sort of magic is going on for them, and I think that's really more of a philosophical. It's not just there's a special magic in the hardware itself, and so if you were to put that much time and effort into training any horse and you stuck any bit in that horse's mouth and you had excellent hands and an excellent seat, would you get the same result? And so, yeah, I guess that's kind of the question is that fair to say, is that it seems as though bit design has certainly changed and there are effects that it has, but those effects are actually more nuanced than what we might expect them to be, in such that one bit doesn't mean a completely different riding style. That they're more of a tool of precision, whereas the real change of riding style comes down to the individual's riding and the philosophy of training.
Sorry, Frederik, who are you waving at?
I was just asking Victoria if she wants to jump in there. I'd say, yeah, it's like, yes, of course, I could teach my horse to do a capriole out of the piaffe, a step and a jump technique, which was how it was called in the 17th century. While the horse is, I don't know, wearing two air balloons above its ears. I can do that. Will this equipment help the horse? Probably not. So I think our ancients, they developed this equipment to make their life easier. Has there been this philosophical connotation that we, in our modern age, sometimes attached to material objects? I don't know. Maybe there are some written sources that enlighten us about that. But what we definitely have lost is, for example, the profession of the bit maker. Yes, in the US and with spade bits, they are still there. But having at least for precious, high value, high status horses, you had bits made to measure, to the tongue, to the bars of the horse, and that we definitely have lost. And if you are putting a piece of equipment that is aimed to help the horse, but it doesn't really help the horse because it's ill-fitting, can we then again take our clues to the equipment of the same style of ancient times, where it would have been fitting? Yeah, it's a complex problem.
We have the example of Jennifer Jobs, who replicated a medieval bit with the projection in the mouth, and it didn't fit, and they didn't get the result, but because those factors that Frederik was just talking about. And
I think Jörg has a comment. Sorry, I think Jörg has a comment. He's got a raised hand. So
yes, hi Jörg.
Thank you. And of course, just the moment I wanted to ask my question, my connection dropped. But no, I wanted to respond to this issue of collection, and it is my considered opinion that at least until they're able to bring their horse into collection, the tactics that are described in the texts only work if all of the riders are able to bring their horse into collection, maintain collection into the attack, and do that over broken ground and information. In the doesn't work. So I would agree with Frederik also. It doesn't matter on the equipment. If you're a good rider, you shouldn't be using your hands. You shouldn't be holding on to the reins. You should be, as Timothy was saying, feet and pressure and your leg pressure. But there's a special form of equitation competition where the cowboys and vaqueros and so on compete with each other. And basically, one of the rules is you cannot use your both hands. You have to ride with work. It's working equitation competitions. You must ride with just one hand on the reins. And at that point, all you're using the reins for is to minute communication. You're not using it to control the horse. So that was my somewhat garbled.
Yeah, I suppose that's one answer to Nate's question. There's definitely the people who just want to dominate, and the people who hope for a more of a partnership. Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to dominate, no, you have to have a partnership because the horse understands the tactics of the game. This is, I mean, Timothy, you've played sort of polo cross. You know that the horse knows what the rules of the game are, and the horse gets upset when the rules are broken. I mean, we saw that at one of the competitions where one of the guys was saying, "Oh, well, you train your horse to."
Your connection, you're a bit unstable. I don't hear you.
By beating it, and our horse started attacking him, not his horse, him. Quite clearly, he said, "This is not the rule of the game. You are breaking the rules of the game, and I will get."
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, is it stable again? I mean, you know, in one of the horse festivals we did, one of the competitors that his philosophy was go on, sorry.
They have a book on pig sticking on the board. On board. He says very specifically the horses are into it. The horses.
So can you hear me again?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. Normally my connection is more stable than this, but yeah, Baden-Powell says it as well. The horses understand the rules of pig sticking, so they get into it. The horses understand what's going on, and they will do the correct tactics on their own, just like in polo cross. You know, if you read Rudyard Kipling's Maltese Cat, that's all what it's about.
Agreed. I agree. I can say this, I'm a polo player as well, so I agree with what you're saying here. They know the game, right? I mean, they know the rules. They know the line of the ball. They know where to go. They get it. And in terms of all of this conversation, I think it's really exciting that there's somebody new asking questions like, how do we understand this, and how does it work through time? So thanks for all these questions, Nate. But you're right. I mean, it is patently proven time and again that a skilled trainer doesn't need a bit, but all bits can really help in different kinds of situations depending on what you want of the horse. So there's all sorts of different people that have ideas about what works and what doesn't. But I was just going to ask about the connection that what I've always found interesting to see. What I see is medieval bits in California. If you look at the spade bits, you're seeing a medieval tradition, and the saddles even a medieval tradition. But one thing we need to keep kind of an eye to with that is the cattle, that they're working cattle as well. There's a reined cow horse tradition, not just in combat and battle, but there's they are working cattle as well with those. But all really good, and appreciate all these conversations. It's really fun to talk about bits that I haven't thought about in a long time. So
Yeah, I spoke to a bit maker here in the States. I called him. He was one of the few guys in California that still makes them, and he told me that somebody had given him just because they thought it was interesting, this old bit that turned out to be like a 16th century bit, but they gave it to him because they thought it looked like one of the bits he made, and he had no idea what it was himself. So here he is, he's making spade bits, in California, and then he has a 16th century bit, and it looks a lot like what he's making, and yet he didn't even know what it was, even though they're very similar. Yeah, so that yeah, I think is one of the things that makes it such an interesting thing to see, is why are medieval bits, yeah, popping up and popping up in the desert of California.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, even the ones they have in Leeds. Unfortunately, there's not. Some people have good collections of medieval bits, and some of them are not well represented in museums. But even if you see the ones in Leeds or wherever, they look very similar to the California bits. As someone who saw the California bits before I ever saw medieval bits, I can say that's really interesting. But the progression is what's really nice. That somebody mentioned Les Voigt. A lot of these reined horseman training books are really lovely because you start out in a lope and hackmore. You start out without a bit. You start out with a hackmore that's not even like really that. It's basically it's got a horsehair on it. It's very kind. It teaches the horse how to give it the pull and collect before you ever put a bit in their mouth. So maybe some of the Americans that have worked through that tradition can talk about it. But it's helpful for polo. That's how a lot of polo people start, is with that kind of a setup.
Okay, so we have Nancy who raised your hand first, and then Frederik who raised his hand second. So maybe Nancy could say what she wants.
I had a question for those of you who have had a chance to ride in some of the hinged bits, coming at it from as I sit here in California, coming at it from the experience of riding in some of the curbs and the spades and stuff like that, where the weight of the reins and matching the weight of the reins is really and the rein chains is really important to how those bits work. Do you find that the hinges prior to hitting a stop point where it either adds curb pressure or it adds chain pressure on the chin, do you find that the weight of moving those hinged metal pieces changes the way those bits function for you at all when you're making just subtle interactions?
Okay, so who wants to answer this? Because I rode in the bit Timothy made just 3 times. It's a very, very light bit, and I think that's part of the reason my pony liked it, because it's even lighter than her like usual snaffle, which is a bit heavier. So there is very little weight, and I train horses to respond to very, very like small move body rather than movements of the bit. I'm trying to teach this to the kids who are riding here as well. So we also ride a bit less quite often. Yeah, so there is practically very little weight, and I think she's responding also to my body position, not just the bit. I'm happy about this. Maybe other people who have more experience will talk more about it.
I can just answer from the point of the archaeological specimens that I handled, and especially the ones that are or are almost complete, so they still function and they're not that fragmented, so they are still functioning in how they were initially supposed to. I think one point considering that is the construction of the mouthpiece, as Timothy also pointed the other reconstruction that you did with a high port. This changes the point of balance of a bit enormously. I mean, that's the whole point of the spade, to bring the horse into or help the horse finding the point near the vertical or lightly in front of the vertical, for example. And that is especially with the hinge bits before the I'm pulling stuff from my upcoming publication already. From the hinge bits before around 1150, before the stop locks are reintroduced into Europe, they are really uniform in the construction of their mouthpiece. So as long as you don't have these stop blocks and you are lacking a curb bar, the mouthpieces are really formed throughout Europe rather uniform. And this, as soon as you have the introduction of the stop blocks and actual leverage, curb bar pressure, then the mouthpieces start to differentiate into different regions. But coming back to the initial question of the rain weight, to my knowledge, I mean, we are a bit on the downside there from an archaeological point of view, because rains usually don't survive attached to the bits. But I've looked through thousands of illuminations between the 7th and 14th, 15th century, and I don't have any, at least iconographic evidence for example, chain reins before the 14th century. So, of course, they might have played with thicker leather, thinner leather, stuff like that. But from my, just to sum it up, I'm speaking way too long, sorry. From my point of view, the point of balance, the construction, the weight of mouthpiece, form of mouthpiece, and the form of the lower shanks of the hinge bit play a much more important role than some sort of rein setup.
Thank you. That was super helpful.
Okay. So, Frederik, there is a request to share the details of your upcoming publication. I just wanted to add that when Timothy was offering to make the bit for me, he asked if he wanted me to have this bit with the high port or the one which he made, and I was like plainly, I'm not quite sure I can manage it with the high port, because this is a young pony. She's 4 years old. She's been worked for 1 year and couple of months by now, or 3 months, and I was aware of some archaeological finds of damaged horse skulls, which might have been damaged by this high port. So I'm like, I don't know if I want to try it out or not on this pony or on any other horse which I have, because I'm not quite sure about how these things work. But I wanted to ask if people would consider this equipment to be safe for like everyday riding training. Just a question.
I think actually the damaged horse skulls that you mentioned from the harbor from the Theodosian harbor, nowadays I think that they are connected with a, let's say, weird Byzantine development of bits. And that actually the invention of or reintroduction of the curb bar and the stop blocks is actually connected to that you don't want to hurt your horse and the pallet. And several Byzantine bits have some features that I cannot talk about right now, that probably made it rather easy to injure the horse's pallet.
Okay.
And just to add, maybe John might does want to say a bit about Rufus and his advice about the first bit that the horse should use. And I think if I remember correctly, these are bits with a rather high port probably, and maybe this is connected to the way of how you train the horse, so that the high port, especially if you're not using it in our modern dressage way with constant pressure, maybe that's the key to that, so that the high port in itself isn't such an issue. But maybe John, you want to just say a few words about that?
Yeah, John, if you
Yes.
have any
Sorry, I'm still muted. No, I'm on. Right, okay. Yes, so I've been thinking about this recently, and basically, to go back to something that's earlier, I think the weight and the balance is very important. That L shape on the, what I think of as the Bayeux tapestry type, clearly is making the lower hinge behind the vertical, and it's obviously deliberate. It's not just chance, was it? And later on, of course, it's straight, so there's something going on there. But as far as your other question, yes, I really don't know Jordanus Rufus because he doesn't really say very much about bits. He sort of lists them, but he doesn't really describe them. Well, Laurentius Rusius goes into details, and his first bit, number 1, and he actually illustrates them, of course, so you can actually compare them to surviving examples, is what he calls a mild bit. And it's useful for pulley, for foals, and it's obviously the first step in training a horse to the bit. And it's described as with 2 cannulae, which are, it has, as the illustrations show, the upper frame has 2 bars across with rollers on. These are the cannulae, the reeds, the cylinders. And yes, there would be some pressure as the bit tightened, because the 2 would obviously move separately and begin to bite into the bars up and lower, but there's no port, there's no spade. It's otherwise, in modern terms, it's not much more than a Weymouth or something with like Timothy's reconstruction. It's the equivalent of a very mild port. So that's where you start, and gradually you introduce, as the horse is trained, to more, I probably shouldn't use the word severe, but more points of contact, perhaps, between the horse's mouth and the rider. And I think that business about the chains, the lower rein as chains, is also an important one. Yes, I hadn't actually realised that business about the 14th century, but it's actually adding to the weight. It's keeping the horse, dare I say, I'm not a horseman, balanced. It keeps it finds the comfort point at which it holds its head, so you holding the reins can do little movements. You don't have to pull on the reins. So it sends signals, as somebody said earlier, to the horse via the weight that is hanging from its mouth. So as not a horseman, I'm interested in the mechanics. I mean, I look at this bit and I think, well, this bit moves, this bit doesn't, this is fixed, I've been trying to work out a sort of way of turning a bit into a diagram, like an electrical circuit diagram, so you could see which bit moves and which doesn't. Do both cheeks, are they fixed, so they all move at the same time? Do they rotate? Does the mouthpiece rotate? It looks to me as if with the traditional spade bit, the whole thing moves at once. As soon as you pull on the lower reins, the spade begins to move. And you've got the extra chains, like the slobber chains, which do something. They must have a function. But I don't know what it is. Over to you, the people who ride horses.
Okay, so there has been commentary on bit damage, pallet, teeth, mandible. Okay, and yeah, I just wanted to add that next year I might try this, the bit Timothy made on 1 or 2 young ponies, because they will be 2 years old next year, and it could fit one or both of them because they're around the same size as the conic now. So we will see. Maybe I will see how it works if I train a horse from scratch with this bit, and will it make a difference or not. But we have raised hands from Jörg first and from Nate second. Okay, Jörg, if you want to.
I just wanted to very quickly say that my hypothesis is that these strong, as they are portrayed, is really that when you're in battle and your horse is injured, and this is the only way to reestablish contact with the horse, to really have something that catches the horse's attention. And that's what the strong bits are for. You don't use it as long as everything is okay, but when you really have to, then you can get the horse's attention.
Yeah, that's a good point, because when we usually ride, we don't ride in circumstances which are battle circumstances, unless maybe competition or tournament jousting could be something similar, but we usually don't ride in context where we can have our horses injured or excited. So that's a good point as well. And the state wanted to say something, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask because it's not something that I had heard before, but it sounds like the modern competitive dressage practice of this sort of constant pressure on the reins or establishing contact, that sort of thing, is pretty modern. So I thought I heard somebody say 16th century, but maybe even after. So I'd love to hear more about that. I know it's not exactly on the subject that we're meeting here for today, or if somebody could maybe drop a link to a resource, that'd be great. I'm just very interested. I hadn't heard that before.
Okay, I think it's a thing about modern dressage. That's what I heard, where if you have the reins which are loose, in the loose outline, you will have points taken off for this. And in classical dressage, you can have reins which are hanging. Okay, but if you are competing in modern competition, then it's a problem. At the end of our volume, Historical Practices in Horsemanship and Equestrian Sports, there was an interview with a dressage trainer who is now the husband of Catherine Duran. He was training her and training young horses, and he says that they have this problem. They're training for modern dressage competitions, but they're training the old way. So basically, they have to imitate this kind of contact, despite the fact that horses can collect without constant contact. I have actually seen this when I was just lunging a stallion which went to high-level dressage, and he was just running on the lunge. There was nothing attached to make him collect. At some point, he started collecting after a warm-up. He just did it spontaneously because that's the way he supports his weight. But yeah, in modern dressage competition, you should have constant contact. Otherwise, you get points off or percentage off. And I'm not a dressage rider, so if there is somebody who competes in modern dressage, maybe they can tell more about it. Yeah.
Hear something from Sally?
Yeah.
Sorry, yes. I'm sorry, I joined you late. I'm afraid I got held up. I don't know. Have you looked at bits? Did you show the Byzantine bit that I'd sent you? Or have you not actually been looking at bits?
I think Timothy discussed some Byzantine bits, and I also shared it in the Facebook group before, so people could look at
Right.
least the picture. And somebody asked me actually for the whole article. Brenda, I think, asked me, and I sent you the article. But yeah, we didn't look at pictures. We just mentioned Byzantine and Roman bits,
Right.
but didn't look at the pictures.
Just I've discovered this 9th or 10th century Byzantine bit with an exceedingly high port, or well, it's not a port, it doesn't allow the tongue anywhere. And it's my belief that this is where the curb began, because I think they had to tie it down because it was just so high that the horse couldn't accept it in its mouth. It just forced it open. And I think that was an important turn. I think that's where the curb really began, as a ring bit rather than as a chain. And coming back to training a horse, yeah, horses, whatever their job, they learn it and they will do their job. But you do have to train them in the first place. And basically, whatever you're teaching them, it's very simple. A horse has to understand when you want it to stop and when you want it to go. And from those two basic things, not done roughly, but firmly enough that it understands, everything can be built from that. That is the basis of it all. And your hands are so much more important than the bit, whatever the bit is. My thoughts.
I haven't actually seen anything that's been reliably attributed to Byzantium myself. And so I'm looking forward to Frederik's publication if he's seen some that are more reliably attributed.
Okay, so more comments, questions?
I just found a few pictures coming back to Nate's presentation, because the term of a spade or spoon is already used in the 15th century with some variations of mouthpieces. So I don't know if can I share that, and how do I do it? Bildschirm? No, I want the presentation.
Should be able to share it. There are no limitations on sharing stuff.
You check. Do you see something?
It's coming for me.
Yeah. So this, for example, is Rufus' adaptation of the late 15th century, where the original point of, okay, at this point in the book, I will speak about several variations of mouthpieces and list them from soft to hard, but in Rufus it's only 3. So this part is in the 15th century adapted to the contemporary variations. And yeah, there you can see I have the translation. Do you guys see that? Just yeah,
Yep.
okay. So down there's the translation where he lists them from basically soft to harder. And there are already roller bits, then spoon bits. These are already really hard. And then at the most extreme are the bridles with gallows bits, and those are the strongest. And because of their hardness, I won't write about those. This again is a part of the original text of Rufus, where he also says, okay, and in the provinces, as bit makers without any experience, they make horrendous bits and they are terrible. Don't use them. And I will not speak about them. Kann ich jetzt hier durch die Folie gehen? Wie? I just have to find out how I go through the presentations. So I will just go through the pictures. This is the already published bit from Tannberg, and this is basically the bit with the hinge in the middle. So basically somewhat resembling a modern curb. There are several also archaeological examples about that. Then we have these roller bits, or bits with just bars, but also very interesting bits that are already very spade bit-like, although the connections are, as with many bits of the 15th century, made sort of movable. So these are the spoon bits. We have several examples of those. And then also the gallows bits. This is a bit from Stettin Castle. Yeah, so that's all I wanted to say, that there are already in the 14th and 15th century some bits that not only fit from the form, but also are already described as such.
Okay. So very interesting. I'm just wondering if people have more questions, comments, or we can be rounding up because it's Saturday evening. Oh no. Okay. So if people will have further comments and questions, we can continue the discussion either on Facebook or in the event section, or you can, like, people want to have details of any of the speakers, I can communicate this privately. We want to continue the discussion, but let's thank all 3 our two speakers and Frederik, who shared his unpublished research, and this was really interesting. And thank you for your time and coming.